The wind in the bitterroots had a clean sound, like ice scraping stone. The wind in Drywash tasted of coal smoke, lye soap, and the sour breath of the rendering plant downriver. Callan hated it already. He pulled his thin pony to a stop in the center of the main street, a rutted track of half-frozen mud that sucked at the runners of his sled. It was late winter in the 1870s, and the town felt raw, a wound scraped in the hide of the plains. He had been alone for 8 months. The noise of 2 men arguing over a mule felt like a hammer blow inside his skull. Callan slid from the pony's back. His legs were stiff, his body locked into the shape of the saddle. He was a lean man, pared down by wind and hunger. His face burned a deep brown by sun on snow. His hands, wrapped in strips of frayed blanket, were cracked and bleeding from the frost. Behind him, the sled was piled high with beaver and marten, a dark, rich mound of pelts that represented a winter of breathing ice and setting traps in killing silence. He had come for fair payment, a hot bath, and maybe a steak that had not been frozen for 2 months. He expected the bath would be the easiest to get. He led the pony to the livery, the sled scraping over patches of dirty ice. He paid the hostler with a small, worn coin and began unlashing his furs, stacking the stiff, frozen pelts onto his shoulders. They were heavy with his sweat and the lingering wildness of the mountains. He carried them across the street to the fur buyer's office, a squat building leaning against the side of the bank. The buyer, a man named Hobson, had soft hands and eyes that measured a man's weariness before they measured his goods. He fingered the marten pelts, sniffed the beaver, and named a price that was an insult. "That's half what they're worth in Cheyenne," Callan said. His voice was rough from disuse, like dry leaves skittering on a plank floor. Hobson shrugged, leaning back in his chair. "This ain't Cheyenne. This is the end of the line. Take it or haul 'em back up the mountain." Behind Hobson, standing by the cold stove, was Sheriff Bricks. Bricks was a thick man, his Bailey pushing against a bison-hide coat. He wore his badge pinned to the coat, not his shirt, as if the law was something he put on for the cold. He said nothing, just watched Callan with flat, patient eyes. He was waiting. Callan knew the game. He was trail-worn, his pony was thin, and he smelled of the wilderness. He was not a man who could afford to argue. He had no allies here. The silence stretched, broken only by the tick of a clock on the wall. "I'll take it," Callan said. Hobson counted out $65 in coin and paper script. It was a brutal discount, a winter's work stolen in broad daylight, as Callan was stuffing the meager payment into his coat. He watched Hobson slide a $5 gold piece from the till. The buyer did not look up as Sheriff Bricks stepped forward, his hand out. Bricks palmed the coin without looking at it, a movement as smooth and practiced as breathing. He tucked it into his vest pocket. Quiet graft. It set Callan's teeth on edge, a familiar, grinding anger. It was the way of towns, men like Bricks and Hobson, feeding off the sweat of men like him. He gathered his empty sled and harness, nodded once, and left the office. The shared glance between the sheriff and the buyer followed him out the door. He needed a drink, not for pleasure, but to wash the taste of the town from his throat. The saloon was half full, the air thick with afternoon light cutting through the smoke. Men from the rail yard and a few prospectors stood at the bar, their voices a low rumble. Callan took his whiskey to a small table in the back, near a window clouded with grime. He kept his back to the wall. The liquor was harsh, but it burned a clean line down to his stomach, cutting through the frustration. He drank slow, letting the sounds of the room settle over him without touching him. That was when he noticed her. She was sitting alone at a table nearer the door, a cup of what might have been tea untouched in front of her. She was a young bride, or had been. She wore a plain blue dress, the kind meant for Sundays, and heavy church shoes that looked too large for her feet. A lace veil was folded in her pocket, sticking out like a white flag of surrender. But it was her face that held him, her jaw, on the left side, was bruised a sick, faded yellow, the color of old bruises. Someone had tried to cover it with powder, but the powder only settled into the lines of her face, making her look both old and desperately young. She was staring at the door, her hands clenched together on the tabletop, her posture rigid with a fear so deep it looked like stillness. Callan looked away. It was not his business. He had seen women with bruises before. He had seen women in saloons, though rarely one who looked so much like she belonged in a church pew. He focused on his drink, on the map of the Bitterroots he held in his mind, already planning his return, planning his escape from this place of soft-handed thieves and silent bruises. The sound of a horse screaming cut through the saloon's hum. Men shoved back from the bar. Boots pounded on the boardwalk outside. Callan stood, moving to the window, wiping a clear patch on the glass. A stagecoach, a mud-splattered wagon, was staggering down the street. It was missing its driver. The reins dragged in the mud. One of the lead horses was down, tangled in its harness, and the other three were winded and wild-eyed. The coach door swung open, and a passenger, a drummer in a ruined suit, half fell onto the street. "Ambush!" the man screamed, his voice cracking. "Masked men, back at the dry crossing!" The saloon emptied, Callan with it. The street filled with chaos. Men ran for rifles. Others tried to calm the panicked horses. The stage was shot through in 3 places. "Where's the driver?" Bricks yelled, pushing through the crowd. "Dead!" The drummer choked, leaning against a post. "Him and the guard. Shot from the rocks." 2 men were pulling someone from the boot of the coach. It was the guard, a Wells Fargo man. He was alive, but barely. Blood stained the entire front of his shirt, a dark, spreading wetness. They carried him, his legs dragging, toward the nearest shelter. They carried him into the saloon. The crowd pressed in after them. They laid the man on a card table. His breathing was a wet, shallow rattle. Callan watched from the doorway. He saw the woman in the blue dress, May O'Rourke. He heard someone whisper her name, push through the men. She had a wet cloth in her hand, dipped from a water pitcher on the bar. She knelt by the dying man. The guard's eyes, clouded with shock and the coming darkness, focused on her face. His hand, slick with his own blood, fumbled inside his coat. He pulled out a heavy leather satchel, the kind a bank might use for coin. He shoved it into May's hands. His voice was a rasp, barely audible over the sudden, awful silence of the room. "For the widow," he gurgled. "Keep it safe. For the widow." He tried to say more, but a cough seized him. A terrible, final spasm. His eyes went flat. He died on the table, his hand still reaching for the satchel May O'Rourke now held against her chest. For a full 10 seconds, the saloon was dead quiet. There was only the sound of the wind outside and the drip of muddy water from the drummer's coat. Sheriff Bricks broke the spell. He shoved the drummer aside and stepped toward May. His eyes were not on the dead man. They were fixed on the bag. "I'll take that," Bricks said. "It's evidence." May O'Rourke recoiled, clutching the satchel. "He gave it to me. He said to keep it safe." "He was delirious," Bricks snapped, his hand landing on the bag. "Give it here, Mrs. O'Rourke." He pulled. She held on. "Funny, ain't it?" Bricks said, his voice rising, playing to the crowd. "An ambush, a bag of money, and here's the brand new widow O'Rourke, right in the thick of it." Whispers erupted. Callan saw the men nearest the bar turning to look at her, their eyes changing, growing hard. Her husband was Liam O'Rourke, wasn't he? A man muttered. "The one killed in the mine last week?" "Heard he was running with robbers," another added. "Heard that mine collapse wasn't no accident." "Maybe she was the lure," Bricks said, his voice slick. He yanked the satchel, pulling May off balance. He gripped her arm, the same arm, Callan suspected, that was attached to the bruised jaw. Maybe she knew that stage was coming. Maybe she was waiting for her cut. May cried out, a small sound of pain and fear. Bricks's fingers dug into her arm. Callan had not meant to move. He had his money. He had his plans. This was not his business. But he saw the hand on her arm. The same quiet, arrogant ownership he had seen when Bricks palmed the gold coin from Hobson. It was the same rotten core. His voice cut the air, low and clear. She keeps the satchel till a judge says different. The saloon went still again. Every man turned. Sheriff Bricks let go of May's arm, but not the satchel. He stared at Callan, his eyes narrowing. "This is law business. Trapper," Bricks said, his hand dropping to the butt of his pistol. "You stay out of it." Callan did not move from the doorway. He did not raise his voice. He just looked at the sheriff. "Frontier custom. A dying man's will stands. He gave it to her. You heard him. We all heard him. It's hers until a circuit judge says it ain't." He was inventing custom, but it sounded right. It sounded like the kind of hard, simple rule the mountains taught. In a town run by men like Bricks, the law was just a word. Custom was harder. Bricks weighed him. The trapper was lean. He smelled of pine and blood, and his eyes were as cold and flat as a frozen lake. He looked like a man who had nothing to lose. Bricks, on the other hand, had a comfortable arrangement to protect. A public gunfight with a mountain man over a dying man's wish was bad for business. "This ain't over," Bricks snarled at May. He let go of the satchel. "You hold that, but you don't leave town. You understand me, widow? That bag is evidence. And so are you." He pointed a thick finger at Callan. "And you. Best you be on your way. Less you want to be charged with interfering." Bricks turned and bellowed for the undertaker. The tension broke. Men went back to their drinks, talking in low, excited voices, dissecting the ambush, the death, and the widow. May O'Rourke stood alone by the card table, the dead man at her feet, the heavy satchel in her hands. She was shaking so hard the coins inside the bag made a faint, chiming sound. Callan waited until the undertaker and his man arrived to lift the guard. Then he crossed the room. May watched him approach, her eyes wide, still trapped in the terror. She fumbled with the clasp of the satchel, her fingers clumsy. She pulled out a small coin, a silver dime, and held it out to him. "For your trouble," she whispered. Her voice was thin, but it held no tremor. Callan looked at the coin, then at her face. He saw the yellow bruise, the fear, and something else beneath it. A hard, stubborn dignity. He gently pushed her hand closed around the coin. "I don't want your money," he said. "Where are you staying?" "The boarding house. Mrs. Gable's, 2 streets over." "I'll walk you." She looked at the men lining the bar, all of them watching her. She nodded. He took her arm, his frost-cracked fingers barely touching the fabric of her sleeve. He guided her through the saloon. The whispers stopped as they passed, then resumed behind them. Outside, the air was colder. The sun was dipping behind the jagged line of the mountains, and a fine, hard snow had begun to fall, stinging their faces. The town seemed to hold its breath. Callan's eyes scanned the street. He saw 2 men in long coats, loitering near the land office. They were Bricks's men. He recognized them from the fur buyers. They were not loitering. They were watching. They walked the 2 blocks in silence. The boarding house was a narrow, gray building with a sagging porch. It looked clean but cold. At the door, May turned to him. "Why did you do that?" "He shouldn't have put his hands on you," Callan said. It was the simplest truth. "No one here," she said, her gaze dropping to the porch floor. "Stands up to Sheriff Bricks. Not for anyone. Especially not for me." The wind moaned, whipping the snow into their faces. He saw her shiver. "You should get inside. Bolt your door." She hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Callan." "Callan?" She slipped inside, and he heard the heavy slide of a bolt locking on the other side. He stood on the porch for a moment, the snow gathering on his hat brim. He looked back down the street. The two men were gone, but he knew they were not gone far. He turned and walked to the livery, his mind no longer on a hot bath, but on the sick. Yellow bruise on the widow's face and the heavy weight of the bag she carried. He found his room at the small hotel across from the saloon. It was cheap, smelled of stale tobacco, and had a lumpy cot. He barred the door and sat on the cot, but he did not lie down. He listened to the town. He heard the snow turn to a driving wind, rattling the glass in his window. Hours passed. The saloon noise died. The town went dark. A knock came at his door. It was soft, hesitant. He was at the door in an instant, his knife in his hand. "Who is it?" "Mrs. O'Rourke." He slid the bar back. She was standing in the hall, wrapped in a thin shawl, the satchel clutched in her hands. The snow was melting in her hair. "They came to my room," she said, her voice a flat whisper. "Tried the door. I can't stay there. I don't know where else to go." He looked past her down the dark hall. It was empty. "Get in." She slipped inside, and he barred the door again. The room was small, lit only by the gray light of the snowstorm outside the window. She stood by the door, dripping on the floorboards. "I didn't know who else to trust," she said. "That was a lie. I don't trust you. I just trust bricks less." "Sit down," he said, gesturing to the single chair. She sat, placing the satchel on her lap, her hands resting on it. He sat on the cot. The wind howled, pressing against the building. "My husband, Liam," she said, staring at the wall. "We were married 3 weeks ago. I came from back east, a male bride. He paid my passage." She said it flat, like a list of goods. "He married me in haste. I found out why after. He was in trouble. He drank. He had a temper." She touched her jaw, a faint, unconscious gesture. "He died in the mine last week, a cave-in. They said it was his fault, that he was careless. The town, they look at me like I'm cursed, or like I'm a temptress, a liar." She fell silent, listening to the wind. Callan waited. "I don't know why that guard gave me this," she said, her voice raw. "I was just there, waiting. I don't know what to do with it." "You should open it." Callan said, "See what you're holding." Her fingers fumbled with the buckle. She opened the flap and tilted the bag. Gold coins spilled onto the small table beside her, a cascade of yellow in the dim light. They were not bank-wrapped. They were loose. Callan picked one up. It was heavy, a United States Double Eagle, $20. He turned it over in his scarred fingers, and then he saw it. Near the eagle's claw, a tiny, deliberate chisel mark had been stamped into the gold. He picked up another, the same mark, and another. "What is it?" May asked. "It's marked," Callan said. "All of it. This isn't just stolen money. This is something else." He looked at the satchel. It was old leather, but well made. He ran his fingers along the inside bottom. He felt a seam that didn't belong. He worked his knife blade under the edge and pulled. A false bottom of thin, oiled leather came loose. Beneath it, folded into a small square, was a single sheet of paper. He unfolded it. It was a ledger page, a list of names, dates, and sums. Hobson, 300. Cawley, 100. Bricks, 400. The names went on. Local merchants. Dates that stretched back 6 months. And at the top of the list, he saw the name. The name of the man who had cheated him just hours before. Hobson, the fur buyer? "This is it," Callan said, his voice low. "This is the graft. This is why Bricks wanted this bag. It's his payroll." May stared at the paper, her face pale. "Liam, my husband, he must have stolen this." "Or he was part of it," Callan said, "and he got scared." As he spoke, a new sound cut through the howl of the wind. Heavy boots on the hotel porch below. Not hesitant, deliberate, they heard the front door of the hotel open. May's head snapped up. Her eyes met Callan's. The fear was back, sharp and cold. Footsteps started up the stairs. The doorknob on Callan's door rattled, hard. Someone was testing the lock. May O'Rourke did not scream. She did not freeze. Her hand went to the shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She pulled it open, and from a sling hidden beneath it, she lifted a sawed-off shotgun, its twin barrels dark and ugly. Her hands, he noted, were perfectly steady. Callan moved without a word. He grabbed the heavy oak washstand, the one with the thick pitcher and bowl, and shoved it, scraping against the door, bracing it shut. The man in the hall cursed. He pounded on the wood. "Trapper, we know she's in there. Send the widow out." Callan stood by the wall, his knife in one hand. May stood by the window, the shotgun leveled at the door. "They'll break it down," she whispered. "Not before we hear them," he said. The pounding stopped. The footsteps retreated down the stairs. They were gone. For now. Callan and May looked at each other in the dark, barricaded room. The wind moaned. "They won't stop," she said. "No." He looked at the ledger page, then at the marked coins. "They can't. What do we do? We can't stay here. We can't trust Bricks. We can't trust anyone in this town. That ledger page is a death warrant." He thought of the mountains. "We have to know why these coins are marked, and why these names matter. We have to know what Liam was into." "The mining district," she said, her voice finding its steel. "Where he worked. Someone there might know." "At dawn," Callan said. "We slip out before the town is awake." They agreed. May sat in the chair, the shotgun across her lap. Callan sat on the floor, his back against the barricaded door, his knife resting on his knee. The late wind moaned around the corners of the hotel. The snow scraped against the glass. Neither of them slept. Callan lay awake, picturing the frostbite scars that ridged his hands. He thought of the winter, of the cold, clean silence, and how it had been broken by the sight of a bruised jaw and a sheriff's greedy hands. May lay awake, her steady fingers resting on the cold barrels of the shotgun. She thought of the husband who had bought her and bruised her, of a town that hated her, and of the quiet, dangerous stranger by the door, a man whose eyes held no judgment, only a familiar, hard-won stillness. They were two people marked by the world, trapped in a room, waiting for the light. The hour before dawn is the color of a fresh bruise, a mix of old blue and cold gray. Callan moved the washstand from the door, the porcelain rattling softly, a sound that seemed to echo in the sleeping hotel. He eased the door open. The hallway was empty, the air stale with the smell of cold tobacco ash. May stood behind him, the shotgun held low at her side, the heavy satchel slung over her other shoulder. She had not slept. Her eyes were clear, fixed on the stairwell. "The livery first," Callan whispered. His voice was barely a breath. "Then the alley behind the mercantile. It will take us to the flats." They moved down the stairs like ghosts. Callan's moccasins made no sound on the wooden treads. May's church shoes, however, seemed to betray her with every step. She winced, lifting her feet high, placing them with agonizing care. The street was empty, scoured by the night's wind. The snow had stopped, leaving a thin, frozen crust over the mud. Their breath plumed in the air. Callan kept to the shadows of the boardwalk overhangs, moving fast. May struggled to keep up, the satchel bumping heavily against her hip. At the livery, Callan spoke quiet words to his pony. The animal was thin, but its eyes were bright. It trusted him. He saddled it quickly, his scarred hands moving with an economy that fascinated May. He had a small pack of supplies, a bedroll, a side of cured bacon, a tin of coffee, and a box of cartridges. "You'll ride," he said. "I can walk," she countered, her voice stubborn. "You'll slow us. Your shoes won't last a mile in the scree." He looked at her feet, then at his own supplies. He cursed softly, unlashed his bedroll, and pulled a thick wool blanket from it. With his knife, he cut 2 long, wide strips. "Wrap your feet, over the shoes. It'll dull the sound and save the leather." She did as he said, her cold fingers clumsy with the knots. He did not offer to help, just waited, his eyes scanning the alley. He was teaching her. She realized, not with kindness, but with necessity. He swung into the saddle, then reached a hand down to her. She took it. His grip was like iron. He hauled her up, settling her in front of him, her back against his chest. The shotgun lay across her lap. She was rigid, unused to the proximity. He smelled of pine smoke, cold air, and leather. He was all hard angles. They left Drywash at a walk, the pony's hooves muffled by the crust of snow. They passed the rendering plant, the sour smell clinging to the air, and moved out onto the wind-scoured flats that led toward the mountains. The sky brightened to a flat, merciless gray. The world was vast and empty, the pines of the high country a dark, jagged promise on the horizon. The wind was a living thing, a constant pressure that stole their breath and burned their exposed skin. "When we climb," Callan said, his voice close to her ear. "Breathe shallow. Don't pull deep. You'll frost your lungs. Breathe like a fox." May nodded, her body aching from the cold and the unfamiliar motion of the horse. She was a woman built for parlors and kitchens. Not for this, but the memory of the doorknob turning, of Brix's thick fingers on her arm, was a fire in her belly. She watched the ground slide by. She was stubborn as flint. She would not complain. She would learn. They rode for 2 hours, cutting west of the main trail. Callan kept them in the low arroyos, out of sight of the road. Finally, he reined the pony in. "The stage stop," he said. Below them, in a shallow basin, were the charred remains of a small building. The ground was blackened, the wreck of the stagecoach still tilted on its side like a dead beetle. "We need to see," he said. He slid from the saddle and helped her down. Her legs buckled, stiff from the ride. He moved over the ground with a trapper's focus, his eyes reading the ash and frozen mud. "3 riders," he said, pointing to the tracks. "They waited up in those rocks. The driver and guard never had a chance." He knelt by a set of deeper tracks near the burned station. Someone else was here, after a heavy man, wearing town boots. May, meanwhile, was drawn to a patch of scrub oak near where the coach had been stopped. Something was caught on a branch, a scrap of dark, heavy wool. "Callan," she said. He was at her side in an instant. He took the scrap from her fingers. It was thick, a dark blue, almost black, the kind of material meant to last a decade. "It's county issue," he said, his voice flat. "From a lawman's coat." The implications settled on them, heavy and cold. This was not a simple robbery. Brix, or his deputies, had been here. Either they were the ambushers, or they had come to clean up the mess. Neither reason was good. "We keep moving," Callan said, stuffing the scrap of wool into his pocket. They climbed all day. The flats gave way to steep, pine-choked canyons. The air grew thin and sharp. May did as he said, breathing shallow, her lungs aching. They dismounted, Callan leading the pony up trails that were little more than goat paths. May's wrapped feet slipped on the granite, and her hands were raw from grabbing at brush. As the sun began to dip, a new, colder wind rose, carrying the promise of another storm. Callan stopped. Ahead, tucked into a cleft of rock, was a small, 3-walled cabin. It was an abandoned prospector's shelter, the roof half collapsed. "We'll hole up here," he said. "Fire'll be safe in the rock." The shelter was small, barely 8 feet square. but it blocked the wind. Callan gathered dry pine needles and dead branches from under the snow-laden trees. He had a fire going in minutes, small and bright. Its smoke pulled up the granite chimney of the cleft. May sank to the ground, her body one complete, throbbing ache. She untied the ruined, frozen strips of blanket from her shoes. The leather was split, her feet numb. Callan handed her a tin cup of water, which he'd melted from snow by the fire. He set the coffee pot in the embers. The smell of it was dark and rich. The silence in the small shelter was different from the silence of the hotel room. This was a wild silence, pressed in by the wind and the sheer weight of the rock. "I didn't know," May said, her voice cracking. She was staring into the small fire. "I truly didn't know what Liam was into." Callan said nothing. He sliced bacon into a small pan. "He sent for me. I was in a factory in Lowell, 12 hours a day. My parents were dead. I had nothing. His letter, it sounded kind. He promised a home, a new life." She laughed, a dry, bitter sound. "I married him for shelter, not for love. I didn't even know the man. I just wanted a roof. I just wanted to be safe." She looked up at Callan, her eyes hollow in the firelight. The yellow bruise on her jaw seemed darker. "And I found neither. He wasn't kind, and he wasn't safe. He was just a man with a heavy hand and a bottle. And now he's dead. And the whole town thinks I'm a harlot who lured him to his doom." Callan set the pan aside and looked at her. His face, burned by the wind, was hard to read. "I avoid towns," he said, his voice quiet. "Been up in the Bitterroots since the thaw. Before that, the Uintas. Towns are loud, too many voices in the mountains. Silence is just silence. You're cold, you're hungry, you're alone. That's all it is. In a town, silence is guilt. It's weakness. If you don't talk, they fill the quiet with their own meanness. They decide what you are, and then you're stuck with it." He was telling her he understood. He, too, was a person the world had misjudged. He finished frying the bacon and poured the coffee. He handed her a cup, and his hard, calloused knuckles brushed the back of her hand. A jolt, sharp as static, passed between them. It was just a touch, the passing of a coffee pot. But it felt like a brand. May snatched her hand back, spilling a few drops of hot coffee. Callan recoiled as if he'd touched the fire itself. They both looked away, a sudden, hot shame filling the small space. It was the first human warmth either had felt in a long time, and it felt dangerous, uncertain and shy. They retreated into themselves. They ate the bacon and hardtack in silence, the air between them charged. Later, as Callan checked the pony, he stumbled on a loose rock, catching himself against a pine. May, watching from the shelter, let out a small, sudden laugh. It was a rusty sound, as if the mechanism for it were broken. It cracked open the tight, whispered quiet of the last 2 days. Callan froze. He turned and looked at her. He had never heard her make a sound that was not born of fear or stubbornness. The laugh died on her lips. A blush rose on her neck, visible even in the blue twilight. He looked away, back to the pony, his heart hammering in a way the climb had not made it. They set out in the morning, the air bitter. They were higher now, in the mining district. It was not a town, just a scar on the mountain, a sprawling camp of tents, lean-tos, and the dark, gaping mouths of mine shafts. Sluice boxes, frozen solid, lined the creek bed. Men with pickaxes and shovels watched them pass. Their faces were gray with granite dust and suspicion. A mountain man and a town woman, one of them wearing ruined church shoes, was a strange sight. Callan stopped a man hauling a sled of timbers. "We're looking for Gray's claim, looking for anyone who knew Liam O'Rourke." The man's eyes flickered. He shook his head and kept walking. They got the same reaction at 3 different claims. Fear. Men turned their backs, suddenly busy with ropes or water buckets. Liam O'Rourke was a name that brought trouble. Finally, Callan cornered a young miner boiling coffee over a can. "We have money," Callan said. A lie. His widow needs to settle his affairs. The young miner looked at May, his eyes full of a mix of pity and fear. "You don't want to be asking about Liam," he whispered. "Not here, not where Pike's men can hear." "Banker Pike?" May asked. "He ain't just a banker," the miner said, glancing over his shoulder. "He owns half this mountain, or thinks he does. He lost a heap of deposits last fall. Men's savings, gone. Men who complained found themselves blacklisted. Couldn't get work, couldn't buy supplies." "Liam complained?" Callan asked. "Worse, he argued with Pike, right in the street in Drywash. Shouted at him, called him a thief. That was 2 days before the cave-in." The miner looked at May. "The cave-in wasn't no accident. Mrs., it was a message." A new wave of cold, colder than the wind, washed over May. "There's a man," the miner said, his voice dropping lower. "Old Ansel. He was Liam's partner. He's in the tent with the stovepipe, up by the adit. He might talk. He's coughing up his lungs. He ain't scared of Pike no more." They found Ansel in a canvas tent filled with acrid smoke. He was an old man, thin as a rail, huddled in blankets. A hacking cough seized him as they entered. "What?" he rasped. May stepped forward, into the weak light. "Mr. Ansel, I'm May O'Rourke, Liam's wife." Ansel stared at her for a long time. "Heard he got himself a male bride. You're her—" He coughed again, a wet, rattling sound. "Liam was a fool, but he wasn't a bad man, just a fool." Callan took one of the marked double eagles from his pocket and held it out. "What do you know about these?" Ansel's eyes sharpened. He took the coin, his fingers tracing the tiny chisel mark. "Pike's mark," he breathed. "The devil's own tithe." "What does it mean?" May asked. "It's his system, his private bank. Pike skims from the deposits. He lends it out to merchants, to the law, to anyone he wants to own. He marks the coin. It's a kickback, a way to track his network. Hobson, the fur buyer, Bricks, the sheriff. They're all on his payroll. When they get paid, they swap these marked coins back to Pike for clean ones. It's a laundering ring, right under our noses." "Liam knew this?" Callan asked. "He found it out," Ansel said. "Liam wasn't bright, but he could add. He was carrying a ledger for Pike, part of his work, running accounts between the mine and the bank. He must have seen the real books. I saw him the night before the cave-in, sitting right where you are. Mrs., he was staring at a page, just like he was staring at a snake. He looked scared, scared to death. Your man looked scared, not crooked." Ansel was seized by another coughing fit, this one so violent it bent him double. When he recovered, he looked at May, his eyes watering. "Pike killed him for that ledger, and he'll kill you for it, too. Get off this mountain." As he spoke, the canvas flap of the tent was ripped open. The wind howled in, bringing a swirl of fresh, heavy snow. A man in a thick county coat stood there, flanked by 2 others. He was broad, with a mean, pinched face. Callan recognized him from the saloon. Deputy Cawley. "Well, look at that." Cawley sneered, his eyes locked on May. "We heard you'd flown the coop. Widow, Sheriff Bricks is mighty displeased." He unrolled a piece of paper. "May O'Rourke, by the authority of Drywash County, I have a warrant for your arrest, theft of bank property, and conspiracy to murder the Wells Fargo guard." The storm was barreling in, the sky turning a dark, churning gray. Callan didn't hesitate. He kicked the small brazier of coals straight at Cawley's legs. The deputy roared as hot coals hit his shins. Callan grabbed May's arm. "The trees! Now!" He shoved her out the back of the tent, through a slit in the canvas. They scrambled out onto the slope just as the first shot rang out, ripping through the tent. "They got horses!" Cawley yelled from inside. "Don't let him get to the pony!" Callan's pony was 50 yards down the slope. tethered near their own supplies. "Get to that spruce hollow," Callan ordered, pointing to a dense thicket of young trees. "Get in deep. Don't move. Don't breathe. No matter what you hear. Understand?" He shoved the heavy satchel of gold into her arms. "Don't lose this." "What about you?" she cried, the wind whipping her hair across her face. "I'm drawing them off. Go!" He didn't wait to see her hide. He ran in the opposite direction, toward the dense timber line, staying low. He drew his pistol and fired a shot toward the sky. "There he is," one of the posse men shouted. "The mountain rat. He's heading east." Cawley and his men mounted up, crashing through the brush after Callan. May scrambled into the spruce hollow. She crawled deep into the branches, the snow-laden limbs closing around her. She huddled on the frozen ground, the satchel clutched to her chest, the shotgun in her lap. She was alone, the sound of the rising blizzard and the distant, angry shouts of the posse filling her ears. She closed her eyes, her lips moving, whispering words to steady herself. "Steady, steady, he will come back." The world went dark. The storm hit the mountain like a fist. Snow fell not in flakes, but in a solid, blinding sheet. The temperature plummeted. May shivered uncontrollably, pressing herself against the trunk of the tree, buried in the snow. Hours passed. It felt like a lifetime. The shouting had faded, replaced by the howl of the wind. She was numb, her fear turning to a cold, dull despair. He was not coming back. They had caught him, or he had left her. Then, a shape moved through the curtain of snow. It was not a horse. It was a man, limping, dark against the white. Callan. He knelt by the hollow, his face caked in ice. "You all right?" She could only nod, her teeth chattering too hard to speak. "Let's go. We can't stay here." He helped her up. Her legs were numb, refusing to obey. He put his arm around her waist, half carrying her. "The pony," she whispered. "Gone. They took it." He was breathing hard, a catch in his breath. They staggered through the deepening drifts to a rock overhang, a shallow cave shielded from the worst of the wind. May collapsed against the stone. "You're hurt," she said, seeing the dark stain spreading across the side of his coat. "It's a graze, bounced off a rock." "Let me see." She was firm. She pulled open his coat. The bullet had torn a bloody furrow along his ribs. It was deep. "Sit," she commanded. From a small pocket in her skirt, she pulled a housewife, a small sewing kit. It held a needle and a spool of black thread. She ripped a strip of cloth from her own petticoat. "This will hurt," she said. She washed the wound with snow, her hands shaking from the cold, but her movements precise. Callan sat rigid, his jaw set. When she pushed the needle through his skin, his breath hitched, a sharp, ragged inhale. He did not make another sound. Her fingers rested on his ribs to hold the skin taut, her touch light but sure. He could feel the warmth of her hand through his linen shirt, a small spot of life against his cold skin. He closed his eyes. She stitched the wound closed with small, neat movements. She was a good seamstress. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her breath fogging. "I'm sorry for all of this, for the trouble, for you getting shot." Callan's hand shot out and gripped her wrist. Not hard, but with a sudden intensity that made her stop. "Stop apologizing for surviving," he said, his voice rough. He looked at her, his eyes dark in the storm light. "They're the ones who brought the fight, not you, never you." He let go of her wrist. She tied off the thread and covered the wound with the bandage. The storm was a white wall. They were trapped. "We can't go down," Callan said, pulling his coat tight, wincing. "Cawley will have the trails watched. This storm will lock them soon enough. They'll wait for us to freeze or starve." "Where do we go?" May asked, her hope draining away. "Up," he said. "Higher. Ansel said Pike hid his surplus in the old Catholic mission schoolhouse. It's abandoned. It's on the high ridge. No one goes there. especially not in a blizzard. Can we make it? We have to. They climbed into the teeth of the blizzard. It was a fight for every step. The wind screamed, trying to peel them from the mountain. They held on to each other. Callan's good arm around her waist, May supporting his injured side. Hours later, they found it, a dark shape looming in the whiteout, the mission schoolhouse. It was half collapsed, its bell tower leaning at a perilous angle. They forced the door open and fell inside. The wind shrieked through the broken shutter slats, but the roof, at least, was mostly intact. In the center of the room was an old, rusted iron stove. Callan, using the last of his strength, broke apart a fallen bench. He used his flint and steel, his hands shaking, and finally, a small, desperate fire caught in the stove. It was not enough. The cold in the building was a physical weight, pressing the life from them. The embers in the stove cast a weak, red glow. Callan unlashed his single bedroll. He spread the bearskin and blankets on the floor, as close to the stove as he dared. We share, he said. It was a flat statement of fact. Or one of us freezes before morning. May hesitated, then nodded. They lay down, not touching, but the cold was too deep. In minutes, they were shivering so violently they could not speak. Wordlessly, they moved closer. They lay on their sides, curved toward each other for warmth, a few inches of space between them. May could feel the heat radiating from his body, and he could smell the scent of snow and faint lavender in her hair. They lay stiff, not daring to bridge the gap, but every inch of the space that separated them burned with a silent, unsaid want. It was not just desire. It was a desperate need for life, for warmth, for proof that they were not yet dead. Outside, the wind screamed like a mourning woman, locking the trails, burying the world in white. The schoolhouse was colder than the mountain. The wind found every crack in the chinking, every broken pane of glass, and screamed through. The tiny fire in the rusted stove was a losing battle, a small, hot ember in a cavern of ice. Callan sat with his back to the wall, his coat open, the stitched wound on his ribs pulling tight with every breath. May was on her feet. She could not be still. The night, spent curved against Callan's back for a warmth that was both necessary and terrifying, had charged her with a brittle, nervous energy. She moved through the wreckage of the schoolroom, her ruined shoes scraping on the dusty floorboards. She ran her hands over the collapsed desks, the frozen stack of Bibles in the corner, the splintered remains of a teacher's platform. He said Pike hid his surplus here, she whispered, more to herself than to Callan. It has to be here. He wouldn't leave it in the open, Callan said, his voice rough. He watched her, his eyes heavy. The storm had passed, leaving the world in a state of blinding white stillness. The light pouring through the broken windows was sharp and unforgiving. May moved into the small alcove that must have served as a chapel. A small stone altar stood against the back wall, a wooden cross still hanging above it. She ran her hands over the stone, pushing at it. It was solid. She knelt, frustration and cold making her clumsy, and examined the floorboards in front of it. One was loose. She worked her raw fingers into the crack, pulling. The board, swollen with damp, resisted. Here, Callan said. He had limped over, using a broken piece of bench as a cane. He wedged the pointed end into the gap and leaned on it. The wood groaned, and the nails pulled free. Beneath it was a dark, shallow space, and in that space sat a heavy wooden crate, about 2 feet long, bound with metal straps. Stamped into the lid was the seal of the Drywash Bank and Trust, Pike's seal. Callan lifted it out. It was heavy. He smashed the frozen, rusted lock with a bench leg. Inside, the smell of copper and old paper rose up to meet them. It was filled with canvas rolls of coin. May picked one up. She saw the tiny, stamped chisel mark. Beside the coins were 3 thick, leather-bound ledgers. Callan took the folded scrap of paper from his own pocket, the page they had found in the satchel. He opened one of the ledgers. His finger, cracked and brown, traced the lines. "It matches," he breathed. It was all there. Dates of stagecoach shipments, sums of money, recorded and then secretly dispersed. He saw the names from their scrap: Hobson, Bricks, Cawley, and others, a circuit judge, a federal land agent, and, near the bottom of a page marked Church Donations, the name Reverend Blackwood. The sums were staggering, suggesting a ring that had been bleeding the county dry for years. The marked coins were the payment. The ledgers were the proof. Pike was not just a banker. He was the king of a corrupt kingdom, and this crate was his treasury.
"He owns them all,"
May said, her voice hollow.
"The law, the church, the businesses, everyone."
Callan nodded, his face grim. "A laundering ring. He uses the bank to steal and the marked coins to pay his men. This is the truth Ansel spoke of." A sound. Callan's head snapped up. It was not the wind. It was the crunch of a boot on deep snow, heavy and deliberate. He grabbed May, pulling her down behind the stone altar, shoving the open crate back into the shadows. He drew his pistol, his eyes fixed on the splintered doorway. May unslung the shotgun, the weight of it suddenly familiar in her hands. Another crunch, then a voice, sharp with pain and anger. "I know you're in there. Widow! And you trapper! The storm's over! You've got nowhere to run!" It was Deputy Cawley. "We saw the smoke from your fire last night, you damned fools!" Cawley shouted. He was close, just outside the door. "You're trapped. Give us the bag and the ledger scrap, and we'll ride out. We'll even tell Bricks we found you frozen. Say the widow slipped on the ice. A tragic accident." Callan glanced at May. Her face was white, but her eyes were hard. This was no offer of mercy. It was a prelude to an execution. "No!" Callan yelled back. His voice was flat and final. There was a moment of silence. Then Cawley cursed. "Have it your way, then light 'em up!" A tense exchange followed, not with words, but with the sudden, sharp crack of a rifle. A bullet tore through the doorframe, sending splinters flying. Callan pushed May's head down. "2 men with him," Callan whispered, his eyes scanning the broken windows. "Maybe 3. "Hand it over," Cawley roared. "Last chance." May raised the shotgun. She looked at Callan and, with a deliberate click, chambered a shell. The sound was loud in the small chapel, a metallic promise. There was steel in her voice as she called out, "Come and get it, deputy!" A second rifle shot answered, this one shattering the remains of a window near Callan. Glass sprayed across the floor. "He's trying to draw our fire," Callan said, pressed against the stone. "Don't shoot till you see them." He watched the window. He saw movement, a dark shape breaking from the trees, running low for the side of the building. Callan raised his pistol, tracked the man, and fired. The man cried out, a short, surprised sound, and pitched forward into a snowdrift. He did not move again. "1," Callan said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Jed!" Cawley bellowed. "Damn you, trapper!" A third man, hidden behind a large pine, began firing rapidly, sending bullets snapping through the thin walls of the schoolhouse. Wood chips stung their faces. From the front, Cawley moved, holding a lantern high, trying to get a look inside. "Light 'em up, Ira!" he yelled at the man in the trees. The lantern light cut a yellow, wavering path through the dusty air. May saw it. She rose from behind the altar, brought the shotgun to her shoulder, and fired. She did not aim for the man. She aimed for the light. The blast echoed like a cannon in the mountains. The lantern exploded in a spray of oil and glass, plunging the world outside into the blue-gray light of the snow. "He's blind!" Callan shouted. The man named Ira panicked, firing wildly. Cawley, screaming in rage, stumbled forward, firing his own pistol into the dark doorway. May chambered another shell. She saw his shape, a black mass against the snow. She dropped her aim, remembering the knee-high kick Callan had used. She fired low. The roar of the shotgun was followed by a sound that was not human. It was a wet, broken shriek of pure agony. Colley dropped, his leg folding beneath him at an impossible angle. "My leg! He shot my leg!" he screamed. The third man, Ira, broke cover. He ran, not toward the schoolhouse, but toward Colley. He grabbed his deputy by the coat and began dragging him, crawling backward, toward the trees. "You're damned!" Colley shrieked, his voice dissolving into sobs of pain as he was dragged away. "You're both damned! You're dead!" Then they were gone, leaving only the dark tracks of their retreat and the still shape of the man Callan had shot. Silence fell, heavy and absolute. The only sound was the drip of water from the roof and the sharp, metallic smell of gunpowder. May stood frozen, the shotgun still pointed at the door. Then the shaking started. It began in her hands, a fine tremor that spread, rattling her teeth, buckling her knees. She dropped the shotgun, the clatter loud on the floorboards. She had shot a man. She had aimed. She had broken him. She wrapped her arms around herself, but she could not stop the violent, uncontrollable shudders. It was not the cold. It was the shock, the realization of the act, the hot, sick violence of it. Callan limped to her side. His own face was pale. He took her by the wrists, his grip hard, steadying. "May," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Look at me. They are gone. You are here." She shook her head, a sob catching in her throat, her eyes wide and staring at the empty doorway. "Breathe," he commanded, his grip tightening. "Just breathe the air. Feel the floor under your feet. It's over. You are alive." He did not let go. He held her wrists, anchoring her to the moment, talking to her in that same rough, steady voice he used to calm his pony. He talked about the wind, about the snow, about the light coming in the window. He did not let her fall into the terror. Slowly, the shaking subsided. Her gaze, which had been lost in the horror, slowly cleared and focused on his face. She saw the pain in his eyes, the tightness around his mouth from his own wound. She took a deep, ragged breath and nodded. "They'll be back," she said, her voice hoarse. "Not today," Callan said, letting go of her wrists. "But we can't stay." They moved quickly. They dragged the heavy ledgers from the crate. "We can't take them all," Callan said. "They were too heavy, and they had no pony." He looked around the chapel. Under the altar. He and May worked at the heavy stone, pushing it aside to reveal a hollow space, a crypt or a place for relics. They cached the two largest ledgers there, along with most of the coins, pushing the stone back into place. They kept one small, thin ledger, the one that seemed to list the core payments to Bricks and Colley, and one full canvas roll of the marked coins. May slid the book into the satchel with the gold. "What about him?" May asked, nodding toward the man in the snow. "We can't bury him," Callan said. "Not in this." He limped outside. The man was dead. Callan took his rifle, his ammunition belt, and a heavy wool coat. He searched the trees and found what he'd hoped for. Colley and his men had been desperate and wounded. They had fled on one horse, leaving two others, shaggy and strong, tethered in the pines. They saddled the horses, Callan's movements stiff. He tied his old sled to one. They loaded the supplies, meager as they were, and rode away from the mission, climbing higher. They stopped on a high ridge as the sun began to set, painting the endless snowfields in shades of violet and blood. The world was vast, silent, and clean. Far below, in a clearing, Callan pointed. A pack of wolves, dark shapes against the white, ghosted through the trees. They moved with a purpose, a silent, ancient grace. The world felt holy, as if they were the only two people left in it. May watched the wolves, her face calm now, carved by the day's events. "Liam married me to spite Pike," she said, her voice quiet, carried on the thin air. Callan turned to look at her. "It wasn't just about the money he lost. It was about me. I worked at the bank when I first arrived, just for a few weeks, clerking Banker Pike. He noticed me. He offered me more than a clerk's position." She looked at Callan, her eyes holding no shame. "I turned him down. I told him I was not that kind of woman. He was a powerful man. He wasn't used to being told no. So he started the rumors that I was flighty, that I was enticing men, that I was trouble. He made it impossible for me to keep the job. When Liam, who already hated Pike for his lost savings, heard the whispers, he saw me as a weapon. He married me, a fast, angry wedding. It was his way of spitting in Pike's eye. He married Pike's ruined woman." Callan stared at the valley, his jaw working. The wind whipped at his hair. "That's coward talk," he said, his voice rough with a sudden, cold anger. "What Pike said, what the town said, it's the noise of weak men." He turned to her, his gaze intense. "My father was a drunk, a good one. Every spring, he'd disappear, said he was going to the mountains. He'd come back in the fall, broke, smelling of cheap whiskey, his hands soft. He never trapped a thing. He just ran. My mother cleaned other people's houses, and I learned to set snares. I learned to trust the weather, because it tells you the truth, even when it's hard. I learned to trust animals, because they don't lie about being hungry. I never learned to trust men who talk too much." He looked at her, and she understood. They were the same, both of them marked and abandoned by the loud, lying world of men. They rode on, into the high passes. The horses were a godsend, but the way was treacherous. They were in a narrow col, a wind-scoured passage between two granite peaks, when Callan stopped. He held up a hand. The silence was wrong. It was too heavy. Then came the sound, a sharp crack from high above them, like the world splitting in two. "Ride!" Callan roared, digging his heels into his horse. They spurred the animals, but it was too late. A wall of white, a thundering, smoking river of snow and rock broke free from the cornice above. The avalanche slammed down into the pass. It struck them not as powder, but as a solid, moving wall. Callan grabbed for May, but the horses were swept away. Screaming, lost in the churning white, Callan and May were thrown, tumbling. They slammed into a massive outcrop of black rock, the only thing that split the flow. The snow poured over them, burying them, and then, as quickly as it had come, it was gone, thundering down into the canyon below. Silence returned. Callan coughed, spitting snow. He was half buried. He looked for May. She was 10 feet away, against the same rock. She was moving. "I'm here," she gasped, pulling herself free. The horses were gone. Their supplies, their sled, everything. Gone. Only the satchel, which May had tied to her own body, remained. Callan tried to stand. He put weight on his right leg, and a sharp, grinding pain shot from his knee to his hip. He cried out and collapsed back into the snow. The landing on the rock had ruined his knee. May was at his side in an instant. She saw his face, pale and slick with sweat. He was helpless. Her terror, her shaking, was gone, replaced by the same steel she'd found in the church. This was simple. This was survival. "Get up," she ordered. "I can't. The knee—" "I didn't say walk." She hooked her arms under his, bracing herself. "On 3. She hauled him to his feet. He was heavy, a dead weight on his right side. She looped his arm over her shoulder, taking his weight against her body. He was the trapper, the mountain man. He was the one who knew how to survive. And he was leaning on her, his head hanging, his teeth gritted in agony. "There," she said, pointing to a dense copse of cedar trees, their branches heavy with snow. forming a natural hollow. "We go there." She dragged him, one agonizing step at a time, through the deep snow. He hauled his useless leg. She was panting, her breath pluming, her small frame straining. But she did not stop. She hauled him by the collar, by the coat, until they fell into the shelter of the trees. It was a cedar lean-to, a natural cave of branches. The cold was immediate, a killing cold. Now that the sun was gone, they had his one remaining blanket, strapped to his back. They huddled close, sharing the blanket, their bodies pressed together from shoulder to knee. The sun vanished. The temperature plummeted. Shivering seized them both.
"Closer,"
she said, her voice muffled. It was not a request. She turned, pressing her back against his chest, huddling small, trying to share their fading warmth. But it was not enough. He was too cold. She was too cold. She turned again, in the tight, dark space, to face him.
"We have to,"
she whispered. She pressed her body against his, her legs tangling with his good one, her face buried in the cold wool of his coat. He grunted in pain as his knee was jostled. Then his arms came around her, pulling her tight. The shivering slowed. There was only the sound of their breathing, mingling in the tiny, dark space. His chin was rough against her forehead. His wound throbbed. Her face was numb. Desire, sharp and aching, crested in the absolute cold. It was not passion. It was a desperate, profound need to affirm life in the face of death. It was the heat of his skin through the layers, the simple, solid presence of another human being. Her fingers, stiff and numb, found their way inside his coat, resting on his chest, feeling the slow, steady beat of his heart. She tilted her head back. His breath mingled with hers. His forehead touched hers, skin to skin. It was a jolt, more powerful than the avalanche. His eyes, inches from hers in the dark, were filled with a raw, unguarded pain, and something else, a want that matched her own. His hand moved, his frost-cracked fingers tracing the line of her jaw, the one that was no longer bruised. Her fingers crept up his chest, to his neck, tangling in the thick hair at his collar. They stayed there, breaths mingling, foreheads pressed together, a promise passing between them in the dark, a promise of life, of a future, of a warmth that had nothing to do with fire. It was a promise held in their eyes, and for now, in the freezing dark, it was enough. They chose restraint. The world was still trying to kill them. When the first gray light of dawn filtered through the cedar branches, it found them asleep, still locked in that desperate embrace. Callan woke first. The pain in his knee was a white-hot spike. He tried to move and grunted. May stirred, pulling back, the cold rushing into the space between them. "We have to move," he said, his voice a croak. They limped out of the shelter. The world was blinding white. "Where?" she asked, already moving to take his weight. "There's a rendezvous site," he said, his face tight with pain as he leaned on her. "West of here, in the valley, a place trappers use to cache goods." He looked back the way they had come, toward Drywash, invisible miles below. "Bricks will have heard by now," he said, his voice grim. "He'll tell the town we shot Colley in the back. He'll tell them we're murderers. The proof won't matter. He'll spin the violence. He'll have a hanging posse on this mountain by nightfall." It took them the rest of the day and half the night to get down from the high col. It was not walking. It was a controlled fall, a brutal, limping descent. May was the anchor. Callan, his face a mask of white, gritted pain, used the rifle he had taken from the dead man as a crutch. May looped his belt around her own waist, lashing them together, so that when he fell, she could take the weight and stop him from sliding into the abyss. They did not speak. There was no breath for words. There was only the scrape of the rifle stock on rock, the gasp of his breathing, and the steady, determined drive of her legs. She was no longer a male bride from Lowell. She was a creature of the mountain, as hard and unforgiving as the granite under her feet. When they finally reached the valley floor, the moon was high, making the snowfields of the meadow below them look like a vast, silver ocean. This was the rendezvous, the place Callan had spoken of, a wide, sheltered meadow where trappers had met for generations to trade, rest, and cache supplies. Callan pointed with a shaking hand. "The creek bend. There's a cache. Buried. Food. Blankets." He collapsed, his good leg giving out. May untied the belt, her fingers numb. "Stay here." She plunged through the waist-deep snow of the meadow, following the dark line of the creek. She found the bend, marked by 3 tall pines. She found the cache site. And she found the ash. The cache had been dug up, the heavy stone marker rolled aside. The supplies, flour, bacon, coffee, blankets, ammunition, had been piled high and set ablaze. All that remained was a large, blackened circle of melted snow and the greasy, sour smell of burned provisions. May knelt in the snow, staring at the ruin. She touched the ash. It was cold, but not frozen. Someone had been here within the last day, someone who knew Callan's habits, someone who knew where to find his lifeline. Bricks, it had to be. He was not just chasing them. He was starving them off the mountain. She walked back to Callan. He saw her empty hands. He saw her face. He pulled himself up on his elbows and crawled, dragging his useless leg, the 50 yards to the burned cache. He knelt over the ashes. He sifted them through his fingers. His traps, his spare knives, his winter's comfort, all gone. A low sound came from his throat, a sound of such brittle, quiet grief that it cut May deeper than the wind. He was not a man who cried. He was a man who broke, quietly, from the inside. He had survived the mountains, only to be undone by the malice of the town. May stood over him, a small, dark shape against the snow. She had nothing to offer, no words. She just stood guard, her shotgun in her hand, while he grieved. They were found at dawn. May had dozed, sitting upright, her back against a log. Callan was shivering, a low-grade fever setting in from his knee. A man on a snow pony emerged from the pines. He was old, his face a map of deep, dark lines, his hair in 2 long, white braids. He wore a mix of cavalry wool and smoked buckskin. He was Nez Perce. He stopped his pony 20 yards away and watched them, his gaze taking in the burned cache, Callan's leg, May's shotgun. Callan looked up. "Tamas," he breathed. The old man nodded. "Knew it was your sign. Callan, but this is not your way. You are messy." "They found my cache," Callan said, his voice a rasp. "They found everything," Tamas said. He swung off his pony. He carried a pair of snowshoes and a small pack. "Dry wash is boiling, like a pot of bad meat." He looked at May. "They say you are a widow thief. They say you shot Deputy Cawley in the leg. They say your mountain rat killed a man at the mission." "It was self-defense," May said, her voice sharp. Tamas shrugged. "The story is the story. Pike has posted a bounty, $500. For the widow, dead. 100 for the man, alive. So Bricks can hang him slow." Callan closed his eyes. 500 for her. They wanted her silenced, permanently. Tamas walked to the burned cache. He nudged the ashes with his boot. "Bricks did this, to make you weak, to make you easy." "We need help, Tamas," Callan said. "We have no food, no horse. My leg is broken." Tamas looked at Callan's knee. It was swollen tight, the trouser leg dark with seeping fluid. "That is not broken. That is shattered. You will not walk on it again. Not in the high country." The words landed with the finality of a stone. Tamas was quiet for a long time. He looked at May, then at Callan. "I have 2 pack goats. Strong. They can carry you on a travois. I have food." "We have no money," Callan said, the words tasting like ash. You have a name, Thomas said. Once, you gave my sister's boy medicine when he had the lung fever. I do not forget. He paused. But the goats are my winter. I am an old man. Callan remembered. Inside his coat, wrapped in oilcloth, was the one thing he always kept, a single, prime silver marten pelt. It was his emergency, his last resort. He pulled it out. It was perfect, the fur thick and untouched by the avalanche.
This,
he said. Thomas took it. He felt the weight, the quality. He nodded.
this is good.
May, who had been listening, opened the satchel. She took out one of the marked double eagles and held it out to him. And this, Thomas looked at the coin. He saw the chisel mark. His eyes narrowed. He looked from the coin to May, then back. He took it. Pike's money. Bad medicine. He tucked it away. The goats and my sled, for the marten and the bad medicine. And I will tell you the safe trail to the river. After that, you are spirits. I have not seen you. He gave them jerky, a small bag of parched corn, and 2 thick goat-hide blankets. He showed May how to fashion a travois from pine boughs and lash Callan to it. The goats, stubborn and strong, took the weight. Dry wash is south, Thomas said, pointing. But the posse will be on the main trail. You go west, follow the river. It is longer, but it is quieter. Good luck, Callan. Do not come back to this mountain. It is not yours anymore. The old trader vanished back into the pines, his pony leaving no sound. They traveled for 2 days, following the frozen, winding river. It was a torment. May led the goats, her body aching, her mind numb with a single-minded focus of survival. Callan, strapped to the travois, was bounced and dragged over rock and ice, his knee a universe of fire. He was delirious half the time, his voice a low moan. At night, May would build a small, smokeless fire in a deep rock cleft, force him to drink hot water, and redress the wound on his ribs. She checked his knee. It was poisoned, swollen twice its size, the skin a dark, angry purple. He would not last long. They had to get out of the cold. They had to find a new plan.
The ledger,
Callan whispered, his voice thin, his eyes bright with fever. We have to get it to a judge.
We will,
May said, pulling the goat blanket tighter around him. In the rail city, we'll find a federal judge. No, Callan said, his mind clearing for a moment. He grabbed her wrist. No judge. Look at the ledger. Pike owns them. We saw the name. The judge is on his payroll. They sell easy. Pike's money, it buys them all. He was right. They had seen the entry. Judge Alistair, 200.
Then what?
May asked. Despair creeping in. What do? We can't fight them all.
A witness,
Callan panted. Not a judge. A witness with no price. Someone scared. Someone ashamed. He was trying to think through the pain.
The notary, the man who signed the ledger.
May pulled the small ledger from the satchel. She flipped through the pages. At the bottom of several, attesting to the private loans, was a signature and a stamp. Deacon Silas Hale. Notary Public. Deacon Hale, May said. The church deacon.
He notarized it,
Callan said. He knows. He has to know. He's a church man. Maybe his soul isn't for sale. Where do we find him? Homestead. Downriver. 10 miles. He keeps bees. Callan's head fell back, the fever taking him again. May looked at the goats, then at the man dying on the travois. They had one chance. Deacon Hale's homestead was a small, neat cabin tucked in a river bend, shielded from the wind by a stand of cottonwoods. The beehives, wrapped in burlap for the winter, stood in a neat row. It was a place of peace. May left Callan and the goats hidden in the brush. She put the satchel and the ledger under her shawl, and her shotgun on top of it. She walked to the cabin door and knocked. The man who opened it was small, bird-like, with wire-rimmed spectacles and a nervous, fluttering motion of his hands. It was Deacon Hale. He was the man who passed the collection plate on Sundays. He saw her, and his face went pale. He knew who she was. Mrs. O'Rourke, he stammered. You shouldn't be here. They're hunting you. Sheriff Bricks says you're a murderer. And you, Deacon? May asked, her voice cold. She pushed past him, into the warm, clean room. What do you say? She threw the small ledger onto his table. It fell open to a page bearing his signature. Hale looked at the book, and all the blood drained from his face. He sat down heavily on his stool. Oh, my lord, where did you get this? Does it matter? May said. You signed it. You watched him steal. You stamped it with your seal. I didn't know, he cried, his voice thin. Not at first. Banker Pike. He said they were private loans, investments for the town. He said it was all legal. He just needed a notary. He said it would help the church roof fund. And you believed him? He is a powerful man. Hale's hands were twisting in his lap. And then I saw the names. Sheriff Bricks, Hobson. I knew it was wrong. I saw him forging deposit slips, moving accounts. He was skimming. He was stealing from the miners, from the widows. By then, I was in too deep. He had my signature. He owned me. He said if I spoke, he would ruin me. He would say I was the thief. He looked up at her, his eyes swimming with tears of shame. I am a weak man, Mrs. O'Rourke, a terrible, weak coward. My husband is dead because of that ledger, May said, her voice flat. A man I am traveling with is dying. You are not the only one he has ruined. Deacon. I know, Hale whispered. He touched the book. I have been living in torment. I confess it every night. Liam O'Rourke. He came to me. Weeks ago, he had a ledger page, just like this one. He asked me what it meant. I told him to burn it. I told him to run. I was so afraid. He looked at May. Pike killed him, and he will kill you, and he will kill your friend. We need you to testify, May said. Hale recoiled. Testify? To who? Bricks? Judge Allister? They are in the book. To a federal marshal, in the rail city. We can get you there. You are the only one who can make this right. You are the only one who can stop him. Deacon Hale looked at his clean, quiet room. He looked at his Bibles, and he looked at the ledger, the proof of his sin. He stood up, his small body trembling. If I go, he will kill me. If you stay, you are already dead, May said. He was quiet for a long time. He straightened his spectacles. I will get my coat, and my own records. I kept copies, hidden. I don't know why. Maybe for this day. He packed a small bag, his movements suddenly precise. He agreed to ride one of the pack goats. He brought a poultice for Callan's knee and a flask of brandy. They left the homestead, a strange, desperate party, a wounded trapper, a shamed deacon, and a widow with a shotgun. They followed the river, the water running fast and dark beside them, choked with winter ice. They had to cross at the wide, shallow ford, 5 miles down. The rain started as they reached the crossing, a cold, miserable sleet that turned the riverbank to a slick, gray mud. This is it, Hale said, his voice nervous. They were halfway across, the goats slipping on the stones, Callan groaning on the travois, when the shout came. There, at the ford, it's them! 4 riders burst from the cottonwoods on the far bank, Bricks, and 3 of his men. They had been waiting. They had known. They knew we'd come for him, May screamed. Go! Callan roared, trying to pull his pistol from his belt. May, run! The first shots cracked over their heads. The goats panicked, bleating, turning in the shallow, rushing water. Deacon Hale, trying to control his animal, was a small, exposed target. May raised her shotgun, firing both barrels toward the bank. The spread was wide, useless at this range, but it made the riders duck. "Get him to the bank!" May yelled, pulling on the lead goat. Another volley of shots. The water around them exploded in white splashes. Callan fired his pistol. One of the riders cried out and clutched his shoulder. Deacon Hale's goat stumbled, throwing him into the river. He came up sputtering, his spectacles gone. "Help me!" he cried, floundering. May let go of the travois and plunged back for him. She grabbed his coat, Bricks, his face a mask of rage, rose in his stirrups and took careful aim. He was not aiming at May. He was aiming at the witness. The shot was flat and loud. Deacon Hale stiffened in May's arms. A red flower bloomed on the front of his gray shirt. He looked at May, his eyes wide with a terrible, final surprise. He grabbed her hand, shoving something small and hard into her palm. "Ledger!" he gasped, his mouth filling with blood. "The other ledger, at the mission, under the altar stone." He pressed her hand closed. "God forgive me." He went limp. The river current pulled him from her grasp, turning him over, a small, gray bundle carried away by the dark water. May stood frozen in the knee-deep river. The rain and sleet hammered her. She looked at her hand. In it was a small, silver ring, the deacon's ring. She looked at the far bank. Bricks and his men were reloading, preparing to finish the job. Callan had the travois free. "May!" he bellowed. "Now!" The grief, the rage, the cold, the absolute injustice of it, it all broke inside her. A terrible, animal sound tore from her throat. She raised her shotgun, a useless, empty weapon, and screamed at them. A sound of pure, primal loss. Callan fired his last bullet, forcing them back. He grabbed her arm as she stumbled from the water, dragging her up the muddy bank. They vanished into the thicket, the posse's bullets snapping through the branches behind them. They did not stop until dark. They found a shallow cave, a hollow in the riverbank, choked with deadfall. May half carried, half dragged Callan inside. And then she broke. She slid down the muddy wall, her body folding in on itself. The sobs started, dry, hacking sounds. She had killed a man. She had watched a good man die. She had his ring in her pocket. It was too much. The horror of the last week, the chase, the killing, the death of the one man who could have saved them. It all came down on her. She sobbed so hard she could not stand, could not breathe. She wept for Liam, for the guard, for the man at the mission, and most of all for the small, terrified deacon who had tried to do right and had died for it in a cold river. Callan, his own face gray with pain, crawled to her. He pulled her upright. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her against his chest, holding her as the storm of grief tore her apart. He didn't say a word. He just held on, his own good arm shaking, shielding her from the wind. The rain soaked them both. Two people, small and broken, huddled in the mud, hidden from a merciless sky. They stayed that way for a long time. When the weeping finally subsided, she was left empty, scoured out and cold. But the fear was gone. The grief had burned it away. What was left was rage, a cold, hard purpose. She pulled back from him. "They're not going to win," she said, her voice a dead, flat whisper. "May." "No, Pike, Bricks. They killed him. They've killed everyone who got in their way." She looked at Callan, her eyes dark in the twilight. "We're not running to the rail city. We're not running anymore." "They have a posse," Callan said, his voice weak. "They have the town. And we have this," she slapped the satchel, "the ledger. And we have what Hale told me. The other ledgers are at the mission, under the altar stone. Proof. We can't get to the mission, and we can't fight a posse." "We won't," May said, her mind working, sharp and clear. "We'll take the fight to them, to Drywash." She looked at him. "Thomas said the town was boiling. Pike has a bounty. When is Founder's Day?" "A few days," Callan said, confused. "Why?" "Because that's when they count the donations. The money for the church roof. The money Pike launders. He'll be there. Bricks will be there. The whole town will be there." A plan was forming, born of her rage. "Pike and Bricks will count the money. In public. In the church." Callan's eyes widened as he understood. "The marked coins. I'll put our coins in the donation box," she said. "I'll plant them, and when Pike opens it, in front of everyone, I'll be there. I'll show them the ledger. I'll show them his name and Bricks's name. Next to the chisel mark, I'll expose the matching ledger entry. I'll use Deacon Hale's name. I'll show them his ring." "They'll kill you before you say 2 words," Callan said. "Not if you're not there. You'll draw Bricks outside. The mountain rat. They're all hunting. You'll accuse him, fight him, keep him and his men busy in the alley, while I make my stand in the church." It was desperate. It was suicide. It was perfect. They sneaked back toward Drywash, traveling at night, hiding by day, using the elk trails Callan knew. His knee was a raw, useless weight, but the fever had broken. The cold mud of the riverbank had drawn the heat. Or perhaps his will to live was simply stronger than the poison. He could not walk, but he could ride one of the goats, and he could shoot. They holed up in the river cave, just a mile south of the town. They could smell the coal smoke. Hunger gnawed at them. They had no food. Callan, his face tight, took a small fishing line and hook from his hatband. He sat at the mouth of the cave, in the rain, and jigged in the river. He trapped 2 small, silver trout. May gathered dry wood. She built a tiny fire, and she baked the trout in the hot ash. She found wild onions by the bank, and she made a small, bitter flatbread from the parched corn Thomas had given them. They ate, sharing the small meal, their movements quiet. A tender, domestic rhythm surfaced in the damp cave. It was a rehearsal for a life they did not believe they would live to see, a life they did not yet believe they deserved. They practiced their roles. What Callan would say to Bricks, what May would say to the town. They memorized the names in the ledger. On the 3rd morning, the rain stopped. A cold, blue dawn broke over the plains. They climbed the ridge above the river. From there, they could see the town. Smoke rose from 100 chimneys. Banners were hung across the main street. Bright colors against the mud. Founder's Day. Callan stood, leaning on the goat, his rifle in his hand. May stood beside him, the satchel heavy on her shoulder. He looked at her face, no longer bruised but weathered, at her hands, no longer soft but scarred, at her eyes, no longer frightened, but clear and hard as ice. He reached out his good hand and took hers. His skin was rough against her own. "I'll walk where you walk," he said, simply. She gripped his hand. She looked down at the town, at the place that wanted her dead. "Then we're not lost," she answered. Founder's Day dawned cold and gray, the bright canvas banners snapping in a wet wind. They hung limp over a street of thick, boot-sucking mud. The town of Drywash was pretending to be prosperous, pretending to celebrate its history, but the air smelled of desperation and wet ash. May O'Rourke walked into the heart of it, carrying a large willow laundry basket. It was heavy, weighted with a satchel of marked gold and the small, damning ledger, all hidden beneath a clean, folded bed sheet. Her sawed-off shotgun was where it always was, under her plain wool shawl, its weight a cold, familiar comfort against her ribs. She kept her head down, just another woman on an errand, invisible. She could feel the eyes of the town, the whispers that had followed her since Liam's death. But today, they slid off her. She was a stone. She was a weapon. Across the street, Callan lingered by the livery. He leaned against the wall as if he were just another vagrant, his hat pulled low, his bad knee throbbing with a dull, insistent fire. He had tied the goats and the 2 mission horses in the alley. Hidden, he watched. He was not a man of towns, and he felt every stare like a physical touch. He tracked the movements of Brix's men. 2 stood by the saloon, drinking coffee, their badges polished. Another, Deputy Cawley, was easy to spot. He was on the church steps, leaning on a crutch, his face pinched and pale, his eyes scanning the crowd with a predator's impatience. Callan's gaze shifted to May. She was a small, determined figure moving through the crowd. She was walking into the fire, and he, her only ally, was a crippled trapper waiting in an alley. His hand rested on the butt of the rifle he'd taken, its barrel cold. May reached the church. The doors were open. Inside, it was warm, overly bright, and smelled of lemon oil and damp wool. Pious townsfolk, dressed in their Sunday best, packed the pews. At the front, near the pulpit, stood a large, ornate oak collection box. It was Banker Pike's grand donation, the vessel for the new church roof fund. 2 older women, the church deacons' wives, sat beside it, nodding and smiling as people dropped in their coins. May walked down the aisle. Her church shoes, the ones she'd worn from the very beginning, made no sound on the runner. She approached the box.
A donation, dear?
One of the women asked, her smile tight. She recognized May. Her eyes were cold. Yes, ma'am, May said, her voice quiet. She reached into the laundry basket, under the sheet. She lifted the heavy canvas roll of marked double eagles. She did not drop them in one by one. She upended the roll. The sound was obscene in the quiet church, a heavy, crashing cascade of gold. It was not the light plink of pennies and dimes. It was a dragon's hoard, a torrent of wealth that made the oak box hum. The congregation turned. Murmurs started immediately. The 2 church ladies stared, their mouths open. May, her hand steady, reached into her pocket. She held up the small, silver ring Deacon Hale had pressed into her palm. She held it for a second, then dropped it onto the pile of gold. The light clink of silver on gold was sharp, like a final punctuation. God rest his soul, May whispered. One of the ladies looked at the ring, then at May, her eyes wide with confusion and suspicion. May turned, leaving the basket by the pew, and took a seat in the back row, near the door. She folded her hands in her lap. She was ready. In the alley, Callan saw Sheriff Brix emerge from his office, strapping on his gun belt. He was freshly shaven, his face shining. He was ready for the Founders' Day speech. He barked an order at the 2 deputies by the saloon, and they moved toward the church. Brix turned, alone, and started cutting through the alley, a shortcut to the pulpit. This was it. Callan pushed himself off the wall, blocking the alley. He leaned on the rifle like a cane. Brix stopped, his eyes, flat and gray, narrowed. He did not look surprised. He looked annoyed. Well, the mountain rat. I heard you'd come down. Heard you got yourself a limp. You burned my camp, Brix, Callan said, his voice low, scraping like rock. You burned my cash. Brix smirked. He hitched his belt. That was a lesson. The mountains teach obedience. Trapper, you should have stayed up there. Should have known your place. Now, you're just a crippled rat in a trap. You murdered Hale, Callan said. The smirk vanished. Brix's hand moved. Fast. Not for his gun, but for the hickory stick he carried. He swung it in a vicious arc, aimed at Callan's bad knee. Callan twisted, taking the blow on his thigh. The pain was blinding, a white fire that buckled his good leg. He went down, but he was not helpless. He lunged, grabbing Brix's ankle, pulling him down into the mud. Brix roared. a sound of pure rage. He was a heavy man, thick with muscle, and Callan was weak from hunger and injury. It was not a fight. It was a beating. Brix got to his feet first and kicked Callan in the ribs, right on the stitched wound. Callan felt the stitches tear, a hot, wet feeling spreading under his shirt. The sheriff drew his pistol, not to shoot, but to beat. He raised it high. "This is for my deputy's leg," he snarled. Callan rolled. Grabbing a broken crate stave, he swung it, connecting with Brix's wrist. The pistol flew, landing in a puddle. Brix bellowed and launched himself at Callan. His two deputies, hearing the noise, came running. They piled on, their boots and fists finding ribs, kidneys, and Callan's face. Callan covered his head. He took the brutal, pounding blows. He was failing. He was not keeping them busy. Then, from the church, came the sound of a woman's voice, clear and loud, amplified by a sudden, shocked silence. Brix froze, his fist raised. He looked toward the church. Callan, seizing the moment, drove his elbow into the sheriff's groin. Brix wheezed, collapsing. Callan, using the wall, dragged himself to his feet. He was bleeding from the mouth, his vision blurring. But he had bought her the time. Inside the church, Banker Pike stood at the pulpit, his hands resting on the heavy donation box. He had given his speech, a long, self-congratulatory ramble about progress and civic virtue. "And now," he said, beaming at the crowd, "with the generosity of this fine community, we will count the funds for our new church roof, a testament to our shared faith." He put his key in the lock. Banker Pike. May O'Rourke's voice cut through the room. She was standing in the center aisle, every head turned. Pike paused, his hand on the box. His smile tightened. "Mrs. O'Rourke, this is hardly the time or the place. If you are here to beg, you may see my clerk on Monday." "I am not here to beg," May said. She walked forward, slow and deliberate. She stopped 10 feet from the pulpit. "I am here to ask you about your donations." She pointed at the box. "The coins in that box, the ones I put there, they carry a chisel mark, a tiny stamp, the same mark that is on the coins you used to pay Sheriff Brix for my husband's murder." The congregation gasped. It was a single sharp intake of breath. Pike's face went white, then a dark, mottled red. "This is blasphemy! She is mad! She is a wanted criminal! Deputies, seize this woman!" The 2 deputies Brix had posted inside moved, but they were hesitant, trapped by the sanctity of the place and the shock of the accusation. "You call me a liar?" May's voice rose, filling the church, shaking with a cold, righteous fury. "Then open the box, Banker Pike. Show them the chisel mark. Or should I show them this?" She reached under her shawl, and the deputies flinched, reaching for their guns. She did not pull the shotgun. She pulled the small, leather-bound ledger. "Deacon Hale kept your records. Banker Pike," she cried. "Here it is, your private ring, dates, names, Hobson, the fur buyer, Colley, your deputy, and you, Pike, thief, murderer." Denial rippled through the pews. "Scandalous! In the house of God! She's a witch!" Pike motioned. "Arrest her! She is delirious with grief." "Am I?" May shouted, her eyes scanning the crowd. "Or are you? Ask yourselves, where did your savings go last fall? Where did your deposits vanish?" A woman in the 3rd row, a rancher's wife with a face like wind-beaten leather, stood up. "She's right," the woman said, her voice trembling. "Our deposits, $400. Pike told my husband it was a bookkeeping error. He said the money was gone. We lost our land." A man stood up. "And my wagon loan. The interest doubled overnight." "My seed money," another shouted. The fear and denial cracked, and beneath it was a year's worth of whispered resentment. The murmurs turned to angry shouts. Pike, his face slick with sweat, saw the room turning on him. The church doors slammed open. crashing against the walls. Sheriff Bricks stood there, his uniform caked in mud, his face bruised, blood dripping from his lip. He saw May, and his eyes went black with rage. He stormed down the aisle, shoving parishioners aside. "You're done, widow," he growled, grabbing her arm in a grip of iron. He spun her around, yanking her arm so hard she cried out, and began dragging her toward the door.
"You're going to hang."
The doors burst open again. Callan stood framed in the doorway. He was a nightmare. His shirt was ripped open, showing the bloody ruin of his stitches. His face was a mask of mud and blood. He was breathing like a winded bull. He saw Bricks holding May. He let out a roar and launched himself forward, his bad leg forgotten. He tackled Bricks from the side, a low, desperate lunge that carried all his weight. The impact was brutal. They slammed into the front pew, which cracked and splintered. Townsfolk surged forward, not to fight, but to see. They pressed in from the aisles, from the pews, their curiosity and anger creating a dense, living wall that trapped the deputies. Callan, Bricks, May, and Pike at the front of the church. Bricks, stunned, scrambled for his pistol. Pike, his escape cut off, his secret exposed, panicked. He grabbed May from behind, pulling her tight against him as a shield. He pressed the cold muzzle of his silver-plated derringer to her temple. "Everyone back!" he screamed, his voice a high-pitched shriek. "Back, or I'll kill her! I'll kill her now!" The crowd recoiled. Callan, on his knees, froze. May, her body crushed against Pike's chest, the cold metal pressed to her skin, did not freeze. She did not tremble. She had been here before, in her mind. As he grabbed her, she pressed the twin muzzles of her sawed-off shotgun, still hidden beneath her shawl, up and hard into his soft ribs. Pike flinched. He grunted, his eyes widening in terror. He could feel the two cold, distinct circles of death pressed against his body. He knew, with absolute certainty, that if he pulled his trigger, she would pull hers. It was a stalemate. "You want proof?" Callan bellowed from the floor. He saw the overturned laundry basket. He grabbed the heavy leather satchel. "You want to know what your town is built on?" He hurled the satchel. It spun through the air and landed hard at Pike's feet. The old clasp, weakened by the river, burst open. A storm of gold spilled across the altar steps. Dozens, hundreds of $20 double eagles, cascading over the wood, pooling in a glittering, damning pile. Every single coin, visible in the bright church light, bore the tiny, unmistakable chisel mark. "There's your church roof," Callan roared. "There's your vanished deposits." May, her voice shaking but carrying over the stunned silence, lifted her free hand. She opened it. Deacon Hale's silver ring lay in her palm. "Deacon Hale gave me this before Sheriff Bricks murdered him in the river," she cried. "He died to see this ledger brought to light. We demand a fair hearing. We demand a federal marshal." The church was a powder keg. The spark came from the door. Deputy Cawley, his face white with rage, stood on his crutch. He saw Callan, his boss's attacker, exposed. He saw Pike, his paymaster, trapped. He raised his pistol, aiming for the bloody, kneeling figure of the trapper. He fired. The boom of the gun was deafening. Callan flinched, the bullet hissing past his ear. The shot did not hit Callan. It went wide. It struck a small boy, no more than 8 years old, who had climbed onto a pew railing to see the commotion. The bullet hit him in the chest. He made no sound. He simply fell, a limp, small form, into his mother's lap. A woman screamed, a sound that cut through the anger, a sound of pure, unendurable agony. The church went silent, not a breath, not a whisper. The entire town stared at the dead child, at the weeping mother, at the smoking gun in Cawley's hand. The silence lasted 1 second, 2. Then it erupted. It was not a murmur. It was a roar. The fear of Pike, the authority of Bricks. It all burned away in that one terrible moment. The crowd surged, their rage absolute. Pike, seeing his chance, seeing the world end, shoved May hard into the nearest parishioner and bolted. He ran, not for the door, but for the side vestry, kicking it open and vanishing. Bricks, forgotten, scrambled to his feet. "To me! To me!" he yelled at his deputies, but no one was listening. The townsfolk were screaming, "Murderer! Baby killer!" Callan fought his way through the chaos to May. He grabbed her arm. "The horses, now!" They plunged out the main door, fighting the tide of the furious crowd pouring in. They ran, limping, stumbling, to the alley. They threw themselves onto the mission horses. As they spurred the animals into the street, they saw Pike. He had stolen a horse from the hitching rail and was galloping flat out, heading south, toward the river flats. Dusk was falling, a cold, gray light. A freezing rain began to fall, turning the mud to slick grease. Behind them, they heard Brix's voice, raised in a desperate, furious bellow. He had rallied his last loyal men, Cawley, on a horse, and the 2 deputies from the church. "Get them! 500 for the widow! Get them all!" The chase spilled out of the weeping, furious town, past the rendering plant, and toward the river flats, toward the place where the stage had been ambushed, toward the place where it all began. The horses plunged down the muddy embankment, slipping, sliding, their breath tearing out in great, panicked clouds. The river flats were a treacherous mire of freezing rain and slick, gray mud. Ahead, Pike, his face a white mask of terror, drove his stolen horse, whipping it mercilessly. The animal stumbled, its legs snapping in the sucking mud, and went down with a high, thin scream. Pike was thrown. He landed, rolling, and came up soaked and cursing. He saw them coming. He saw the dark, fast-moving water of the river just yards away. A small skiff was tied to a willow snag, bobbing in the current. He scrambled for it, clawing through the reeds, his fine town coat ripping, his only thought escape. May was off her horse before it stopped, landing ankle-deep in the freezing floodwater. She raised the shotgun, its barrels dark with rain. Callan was right behind her, sliding from his own mount, his bad leg collapsing as he landed. The pain a white-hot scream. He stayed on one knee, rifle up, covering her. "Pike!" May's voice was not a shout. It was a cold, flat command that cut through the wind. Pike froze, his hand on the skiff's rope. He turned. "You're done running," May said, wading closer. The reeds and muddy water sucked at her skirts. "You!" he shrieked, his voice cracking. "You cursed widow! Look what you've done! You've ruined me!" "You did this," she said, her voice dropping, deadly quiet. "You and your greed. You killed my husband." "Your husband?" Pike laughed, a wild, bubbling sound. "Your husband was a fool, a drunk with a loud mouth." "Say his name," she demanded. The wind whipped her hair across her face, but she did not blink. "Say Liam's name." "Liam?" Pike spat into the water. "Liam O'Rourke should have kept his mouth shut. He found the ledger. He was stupid enough to confront me. He was going to ruin everything." "So you killed him," she whispered. "The cave-in was a warning," Pike shrieked, fumbling with the knot, his eyes darting from May to the approaching thunder of hoofbeats behind her. "He didn't listen. The ambush? I had to get the coins back. He deserved it. They all deserved it." The confession, raw and hateful, hung in the air. Just as Pike ripped the knot free, 4 horses burst through the reeds. Sheriff Brix, his face a mask of mud and fury, reined in. He saw Pike, the skiff, and May. He raised his rifle, aiming center mass at the woman who had cost him everything. "It's over! Widow!" he roared. Colin, still on one knee, saw the aim. He threw himself forward, a desperate, sideways lunge, putting his own body between Brix's rifle and May. "No!" For one, agonizing breath. May saw her future end. She saw Callan, exposed, his arms wide, ready to take the bullet meant for her. She saw Bricks, his finger tightening on the trigger. She did not wait. She did not think. She acted. She swung the shotgun from Pike to her left, firing both barrels not at Bricks, but at Pike, who, seeing his chance, was drawing his own silver derringer. The blast tore the air. It did not hit his chest. It hit his hand, the one holding the pistol. The derringer exploded in a flash of metal and blood. Pike screamed, a high, thin sound, as his hand dissolved. At the exact same instant, Bricks fired. His bullet, aimed at Callan's heart, tore through the empty space where Callan had been. But Callan's lunge had been too slow. The shot, meant to kill, ripped through the flesh of May's upper arm, spinning her half around with the force of it. A line of pure fire, a graze, but deep. Callan, his lunge complete, his purpose served, used his momentum. He grabbed the ankle of Bricks's horse, pulling with all his remaining strength. The horse reared, screaming, and Bricks, unbalanced, toppled from the saddle. Callan tackled him as he fell. The two men crashed, locked together, into the deep, churning water of the river. The skiff, now loose, was kicked free by the struggle. Pike, clutching the bloody ruin of his hand, stumbled back and fell into it. The small boat, caught by the full force of the current, flipped. Pike was dumped into the freezing water. The current grabbed him, dragging him, his screams bubbling, toward a massive snag of dead trees, a place that would pull him under and never let him go. May, her arm burning, watched him being swept away. She saw Callan and Bricks, two dark shapes struggling in the river, fists rising and falling. She saw the other deputies, Colley and the two men, dismounting, their guns drawn, confused by the sudden chaos. She looked at Pike. He was going under. She dropped the shotgun into the mud. She grabbed the skiff's long rope, still tied to the willow, with her good arm. She threw it. The coiled rope landed hard across Pike's chest. He grabbed it, his one good hand locking on.
This isn't vengeance. Pike!
She choked out, the pain in her arm flaring.
This is the law.
She braced her feet in the mud and hauled him, sputtering, sobbing, and bleeding, back to the shore. She dragged him onto the bank like a drowned rat, a man saved to face justice, not the river's mercy. Then the lights came. Dozens of lanterns, bobbing and weaving through the trees. The roar of the crowd. The townsmen surged onto the riverbank. They were led by the ranch wife and the storekeeper. They were armed with rifles, shotguns, and a terrible righteous anger. They saw it all in the sudden, flickering glare. May, her arm dripping blood, holding the rope. Pike, a broken, weeping man at her feet. And Callan, dragging a half-drowned, gasping Sheriff Bricks from the river. The storekeeper, a man named Peters, held his lantern high. In his other hand, he held a piece of paper. "I found it," he shouted to the crowd. "The telegraph operator gave it to me. A federal circular from Cheyenne. It warns of coin mark schemes. It describes this very mark." He grabbed a handful of the gold Callan had spilled on the church steps, which he had stuffed in his pockets. He held a coin to the light. "It's him! Pike! He's been robbing us all!" The crowd's fury, which had been for the death of the boy, now found its true target. They surged forward. "Murderer!" the ranch wife screamed, pointing not at Pike, but at Bricks. "You killed that boy in the church! You let this happen! You killed Deacon Hale! You are a murderer!" Deputy Colley, who sat on his horse, his crutch balanced on his saddle, began to shake. He looked at the dead boy's father, who stood at the front of the crowd, his face a blank mask of grief. He looked at Bricks, who was trying to pull his pistol from its wet holster. "He did it," Colley said, his voice cracking, but carrying in the sudden silence. "Bricks, he did it all." Every head turned to him. He ordered the trappers' camp burned," Colley confessed, the words tumbling out. To starve them out. He and Pike. They split the stage money. I saw them. It was all true. What the widow said, it was all true. That was the end. The other two deputies, seeing the crowd, hearing the confession, dropped their guns. The townsmen closed in, a tight, silent ring of lanterns. Brix looked at Callan. He looked at May. He looked at the faces of the people he had ruled. There was no escape. He was soaked, defeated, and exposed. Slowly, his hands shaking, he reached up, unpinned his badge, and let it fall into the mud. He sagged, his hands raised. Weeks later, the town was different. A federal marshal had arrived, summoned by the telegraph. He took custody of Pike, his hand bandaged, and Brix, in chains. The fur buyer, Hobson, the preacher, and half a dozen other merchants signed affidavits, their loyalty to Pike dissolving in the face of federal prison. Cawley, in exchange for his testimony, was given a lighter sentence. May O'Rourke traveled to the rail city in Cheyenne. She stood in a clean, bright courtroom before a federal judge who was not on Pike's payroll. She told her story. She cleared Liam's name, painting him as a foolish man who saw a crime and did not know what to do, not a conspirator. The judge listened. He ordered Pike's assets, the bank, the lands, seized. He ordered restitution, what little there was, to be paid to the miners and depositors. Callan's knee, as Thomas had warned, did not heal true. It would always be stiff, a reminder. He sold the last of his prime furs, the ones he had kept hidden, the ones Thomas had not taken. He got a fair price, this time with the money. He did not buy traps. He bought 2 strong mules, a wagon, and a plow. He and May did not leave. They went back to the rendezvous meadow, to the burned-out cache. They rebuilt it. They built a homestead, small and solid, near the river bend. Callan, his limp pronounced but his shoulders strong, set the posts. May, her arm healed, leaving a thin, white scar, turned the earth for garden rows. They built a smokehouse for winter meat. They built a table, made of pine, that was long enough for neighbors. Their love, no longer a desperate thing hidden in storm-wet shadows and river caves, settled and deepened. It became a steady flame, a quiet hearth they tended daily. Their vows were not spoken. They were in the small gestures. They were in Callan, waking before dawn to warm May's gloves by the stove before she went out to milk the goat. They were in May, her hands gentle, braiding his hair back before he rode out to check the rabbit snares he now kept closer to home. The fierce, boundary-pushing desire found them on quiet nights, after the work was done, when the cabin was filled with the smell of wood smoke and baking bread. It was an intimacy born from absolute safety. There was no fear in this small room. There was only tender exploration, a relearning of what touch could be. It was breaths sinking in the dark, shy laughter that turned, slowly, to a fierce, quiet devotion. It was an anchoring, a healing of all the old, cold wounds. They hosted a memorial at the church in Drywash. The building was clean, the broken pew repaired. The whole town came. They mourned the boy Cawley had shot, and they mourned Deacon Hale. May, standing at the front, her voice clear, spoke not of vengeance, but of mercy, the kind of mercy that burns, and the kind that builds. The town, which had once whispered that she was a curse, listened. They nodded. They were healing, too. In the first thaw of the following spring, they stood on their new porch. The snow was retreating, the land breathing. A wedge of geese arrowed north, their calls thin and high in the clean air. The river was running high, still wild, the land still hard. May rested her palm over Callan's hand, where it rested on the porch rail, her skin over his, over the old frostbite scars and the new calluses of a farmer. "We made it true," she said, her voice quiet. He turned his hand, lacing his fingers with hers. He looked at the mountains, greening in the distance, a place that was no longer his home. "We keep making it," he answered. Hope, they had learned, was not a gift. It was a root. It grew slow, earned and stubborn, and it held deep. Their names, once whispered as curses, had become a promise. Two people who had chosen one another against the cold, and had won. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to hear where you're listening from. Please drop a comment. Be sure to subscribe to From Wild West for more stories like this. We look forward to reading your thoughts in English in the comments below.